Hello, all, and welcome to Chapter 8. So we're going to skip over the material from Chapter 7. You guys can go ahead and look at it. It's very similar to when we were talking about the isoquants and utility curve development, except applied on the cost side. We're really skipping it because there's not a lot of value to it, and I think I've mentioned this before. The ag econ books tend to be a little old-fashioned, and not really the way economists do things at this point in time. So, it's something you might see in a more advanced class if you became an agricultural economist. Really, most of the textbook covering this area of economics right now are at the graduate level and have kind of switched over. Calculus is a better tool for analyzing these sorts of ideas. And so there's not a lot of usefulness in kind of just the geometric representation that you get without doing the math involved, right? So if you're interested in doing that, it's really about cost minimization for the producer, right? And selecting the combination of costs, so labor and technology loosely, or you could think about it competing different technologies or different versions of tractors, different versions of seed or chemical combinations, amounts of water, methods of getting water. But it's really the goal is to maximize your production while maximize your revenue while minimizing your costs, right? And so if profit is maximized at the point where you make the most money and you lose the least money through paying to make it, right? So anyway, it is what it is, but we're going to talk about the development of the firm's supply curve. So last time in Chapter 6, we really looked at the breakdown of what are the various costs, fixed costs and variable costs that firms face, and how we as economists will measure those costs and create marginal cost curves and average cost curves and total cost curves and all of those things. And so now we're just going to put it to the idea and concept of supply curves. So once again, we've got our learning objectives. You feel free to pause and so you can read through these. I'm not going to go through and read them for you. And I'm going to say the PowerPoint on this presentation is a little lacking, in my opinion. There could be a lot of expansion. It does cover the bare bones, right? But if you need more examples, as always, feel free to send me a text message and we can put up some more examples, or I can link through to another video. Nothing too challenging, but it is what it is. So here's the supply curve. So first I want you to notice, we're not labeling this as a supply curve yet. We're labeling this really as the marginal cost curve, and it's not the complete marginal cost curve. If you recall from prior lecture from Chapter 6, a marginal cost curve is a little more like a shallow U that goes steeper on the right end of the curve, right? And so we're looking at the part of the cost curve where it goes from its minimum to its maximum, right? And so the way you're presenting this in the book is that we're looking at the price at shutdown level, and that price that we achieve that covers our average variable cost. That's the point at which we're going to take that marginal cost curve, and we're going to say, okay, if we produce one more item, right? If we get a little more money and we produce one more item, how many items are we going to produce, right? If the price goes up a little more, how much more are we going to produce, right? And so what we're really looking at is at the margin for every item we produce, what do we need to be paid to motivate us to produce that item? And so we're looking at that upward sloping part of the marginal cost curve, and that's what's going to become, in general, the supply curve for the market. Marginal revenue is just going to be at that solid line. That's where we're saying the price is currently, right? And so if our marginal revenue equals marginal cost, we know that's where we're maximizing profit from last time. And so we'll have our output at maximum. We've got our price at break even, which we've determined, outside of this model, obviously, we'd need to know something about cost curve. So we're just telling you this is the break even price, somewhere around, what is that, 28, and the shutdown price around 19. And so as the price rises, firms want to produce more, right? That's a basic component of economics. As prices rise, you want to purchase less. As price rises, the company wants to produce more. And we see this a lot in everyday life. I don't know why, but I have a tendency to look at car dealerships as I'm driving by, and I've noticed there were some cars the last few years, I'm thinking in particular Jeep Wranglers, that were out of stock and hard to get, and prices were sky high. And now every time I drive past a Jeep dealership, there's a lot of cars in the lot. And I can only guess that the executives at Jeep, Chrysler, FCA decided that they were going to produce more Jeeps, assuming that the high prices would last forever. Not really taking into account that there were a lot of people purchasing for COVID purchases. I know quite a few people who purchased stupid items, including Jeeps, during COVID. So is what it is. I purchased a stupid Suburban and not a new one. So anyway, I kind of regret it and, getting my 6 miles to gallon. So it is what it is. So here we've got our market supply curve. This one's interesting. So what we're really looking at here is the individual supply curve for two different producers, Gary Grower and Ima Gardner. Kind of humorous. And so if we take those supply curves, what we're seeing is at 50 cents, there's zero production, right? That's what a Gary Grower won't produce anything. Ima won't produce anything either. So at 50 cents, there's zero production on the market one. And as we move to $1, Gary's willing to sell 1 unit, 1 ton of broccoli. Ima Gardner, she's not willing to sell still. So it's 1-to-1. We're just adding this up. At a price of $1.50, Gary's willing to do 2 tons and Ima is willing to do 1 ton. So 2 plus 1 is 3. And so we go up from 3 and that's our 150. And you can follow this out at $2. We can look, it looks like it's about 3 tons for Gary. And at $2, it looks like 2 for Ima. So at 5 tons in the market and 2. All a market supply curve is the linear summation, right? What we just did is the linear summation of all the individual market participants in writ large. They're growing broccoli of similar spec. Remember, we've got that requirement for perfectly competitive markets of homogeneous or homogeneous product structure, right? So to the extent that these broccoli is interchangeable in the market's view, right? As a consumer, you don't view Gary or Ima's broccoli as different, then they participate in the same market. Okay. So just like we had consumer surplus, and just as a reminder, consumer surplus was the price above, was the area above the price line and below the demand curve, right? And so it represented all of those purchasers who were willing to buy something for more, but got a cheaper price because of something in economics we call the law of one price. So remember, in perfectly competitive markets, producers go out and they sell their good for a price, and people take it or leave it, and consumers receive that price and take it or leave it. And when there's lots of competition, like say at a farmer's market for produce, what you tend to see is that all of the fruit and veggie stands, they get clustered around certain key prices, right? There might be higher producer prices, there might be lower, to the extent that an individual producer believes they have a better product. Or a worse inferior product, or they just have too much, right? So sometimes one producer will go on sale relative to others. But as a generality, when I walk through the farmers market, a lot of the producers have very similar pricing structures. And that's a result of perfectly competitive markets and that law of one price. And so if there's one price in the marketplace for whatever we're selling, then we say, look, this is the product price at $4, and we've got our market supply curve. Then there were producers that are under that $4 price that would have been willing to sell quantities, right, in the marketplace. Just like if we take a step back to the previous slide, Gary Grower was willing to sell at lower prices than Ima Gardner, right? And so Gary benefited by getting higher prices in the market, will benefit from higher prices in the market, right? He'll get some of those. So if the price just happened to be $2, he's going to get some extra profit that he wasn't anticipating that Ima wouldn't have gotten, right? Because Ima wasn't willing to sell at the lower price, right? So this producer surplus is just the area underneath the price line, so underneath that 4 line and above the supply curve. So at $4, our producer surplus is the triangle formed by A, B, and C, right? That lower triangle. If we want to look at the price raising to $6, that means more producers are selling product that they wouldn't have before, and there's more product coming online that people wouldn't have been willing to sell. And that price at $6 forms the CED triangle, that big triangle. And the gain in price is just the difference between the area of those two triangles. If we had numbers on the output side And for that price point at C, we could actually calculate the triangle ABC, and we could calculate the bigger triangle and subtract the smaller triangle from the bigger and figure it out. Or we could just calculate the area of this smaller triangle from B, right, going vertical to D and back on the hypotenuse. And then we could calculate the area of the rectangle ABE on the left side and add those two together to figure out our increase as well, right? So multiple methods using geometry to just calculate these ratios, nothing big here. So equilibrium price determination with perfect competition means that we're going to sell at what's called a market clearing price or a market clearing quantity, right? So the price will be the same and the quantities will be the same. So the amount supplied in market will equal the amount demanded. So if we have two consumers and two producers, then what we find is if consumer one wants 6 quantities at price at equilibrium and consumer 2 wants 3, then the total quantity demanded was 9. And for our suppliers, we know we're in balance if there's an equilibrium, right? And so at the price at equilibrium, there's 5 for willing to be sold by producer 1 and 4 by producer 2, and that equals 9 as well. When we put the graphs together, we have our upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curve, and that those market supply and demand curves, where they intersect, tells us that this is the price, the same price for both parties will result in this total quantity being needed in the marketplace, right? So later on, we're going to imagine what happens if the price is above or below equilibrium. And then that'll be later on this lecture. And then later on in the semester, not much later, probably 2 weeks from now, we're going to actually look at what are some of the things from government intervention and price interventions that allow for prices to be above or below equilibrium in a sustainable fashion, since the government's regulating it. And what are the impacts of that? So there are things that can shift supply and demand curves, right? And so if we think about what can increase demand, I'm going to give you a simple model, right? It'll be a verbal model, but a simple model. So from a market perspective, supply and demand can be impacted by the change in the number of consumers or producers. So remember, if a demand curve is just a linear summation of all the demand curves, and a supply curve is the linear summation of all the supply curves, if you have more producers, then you have more total supply available at any price. The supply curve then just would shift to the right on this graph. We don't have a picture of it, but that's what would happen. If you end up with more consumers, then look at panel A, you've got an increase in the quantity demanded at any given price. Your demand curve increases. So from a market perspective, changes in suppliers and producers will shift or move the whole demand curve or the whole supply curve. At an individual level, there's lots of stories we can tell on why the demand curve would shift. The main catch-all story is that there's a change in preferences, right? And this will impact individual demand curves. And if the preference changes at a macro level, right, it's writ large, then it'll change everyone. So I want you to think about the nature of superfoods, right? Over my lifetime, there's been various foods that have come along. Acai, kale was considered a superfood. I'm just trying to think of some of the others. Those are the two big ones I'm thinking of. Pomegranate was a superfood, right? A lot of times we think these high antioxidant rich foods. And so when there's a lot of news articles flowing around, when Oprah's running a special episode on the benefits of pomegranate juice, we tend to see that at the system level, right, at the market level, the demand for the product goes up. And that's because people's preferences have changed. But there are lots of sub-preference stories that we can talk about. So if your income changes or your wealth changes, that might change your preferences, right? Not always, but it might. For many people, as their income goes up, they prefer more of what they wanted before, and they shift consumption away from cheaper goods towards more expensive goods, right? So maybe you used to eat McDonald's hamburgers, and now you eat better quality hamburgers from, I don't know where you'd go. I go to Broderick's up in Sacramento for a good burger. So you go to Broderick's, right? A lot more expensive. And so though there's stories like that, we can also talk about changes in the price of other goods, which we did with elasticity, right? But remember that elasticity change was actually shifting the curve, right? So income and wealth shifted the curve. Also, change in the price of substitutes or complements will shift your curve as well. Not rotate it, shift it, move it. So those are some of the basic preference stories we can tell, and we can break those down into smaller groupings, but that's why I like thinking. When we think about supply, what are some of the things that can change supply? Well, remember, what's the supply curve? It's a marginal cost. It's the upward sloping portion of the marginal cost curve. What's a market supply curve? It's the summation of all the producers' upward sloping portions of their marginal cost curve. If that's true, then the only thing that can change the supply curve is anything that changes your cost curve. Well, your marginal cost curve, but anything that changes your cost will do that. So if you end up with a labor problem and your workers go on strike, that's going to shift, right, your supply curve. It's going to shift your cost structure. If the cost of your inputs goes up, if you have a technology that saves money or increases productivity, then your supply curve can go up, right? So anything that changes costs. So remember, just to backtrack, if we have a shift in the demand curve, it's either a change in the number of consumers, up or down, or it's a story that tells us that there's a change in preferences. If we have a shift in the supply curve, it's a change in the number of producers, up or down, or it's a change in our cost structure and how much it costs us to produce the good. Those are our main stories. If all we have is the story that the price of a good changes and there's no reason behind the change, then we can't shift the curve. We just have to stop being at the equilibrium price. We're either too high or too low, right? So what economists say is we move along the curve. We don't shift the curve when the price changes. If the price of a good, not the market that we're analyzing. So if we're analyzing the market for broccoli and we look at the price change in carrots, that's a story. And so if the price of carrots go down, maybe people substitute carrots for broccoli and they consume less broccoli, right? And demand goes down. So these shifts are, very specific, right? And so if a shift goes up or down, we can see what happens. But the reasons for the shift and interpreting those is a little more artistic, right? It's your ability as an economist to listen to the story and determine what curves you think it's going to primarily impact. Because there are secondary impacts, but we're concerned with the primary impact of a change. So if we look at that graph on A and demand went up, we go from our first graph to the next one, which is D star. Then we can see that the price at equilibrium would have gone up and the quantity went up. And that's because demand changes produce price changes and quantity changes that are correlated. They move together. So price goes up, quantity goes up. Price goes down, quantity goes down. And so when you see that demand curve goes up, everything goes up. Demand curve goes down, everything goes down. If we drew this graph for a supply curve, which unfortunately for the supply curve, which unfortunately your book does not do. Actually it does on the next one. Sorry, my blank. So if we do this for the supply curve, what we'll see is a different relationship, which is that supply is inversely related to quantities, to prices. So as the supply curve increases in quantity in graph C, the supply curve increases. We go from S to S star or S asterisk. The price went down and the quantity went up. So supply is inversely correlated with price. Makes sense. So supply goes up, price goes down. Quantity goes up as well. Likewise, with a decrease in supply, right? Supply goes down, price goes up, inverse relationship. And supply went down, quantity supplied went down. And that makes sense. Think about it. If producers are willing to sell more in graph C at any price, then you would expect that any change in price is going to result in selling more, right? So we can use the concepts of market demand and supply to assess the effects of events in the economy that have upon well-being of consumers. And we do this by talking about economic surplus. And the economic surplus is the size of the consumer and producer surplus. So if we have a change in shift that results in surplus going up, then everyone's better off. And if it goes down, or not everyone, but it's the economy writ large is better off. And likewise, if we see a decrease, then the economy at large is worse off. Depends on how the shift goes. So we can imagine if the price goes up, producers benefit and consumers lose out. But we would tend to need to actually look at a graph and see what was going to happen. So area 1 represents consumer surplus at the price of the equilibrium, PE. And that's going to be that area above the line and above the price line and below the demand curve. Producer surplus is the area below the price line and above the supply curve. And we add those together to get to our level of economic well-being. So if we have a drought that's going to shift the supply curve from S to S star, that means that our price at equilibrium goes up, and that also means that our quantities consumed goes down. And so we can look at what's happening, and we can say before the drought, when we're at this S and we've got PE, then we're going to be looking at having the consumer surplus is going to be area 3, 4, and 5. And the producer surplus before the drought is 6 and 7. After we have a drought and we shift to S star, then our consumer surplus ends up being area 3, and we lost 4 and 5. And for our producer surplus, we end up with 4 and 6, and we lose 4 minus the 7, right? One way. Yeah, I guess that's probably how we'll look at it. So anyway, fairly straightforward, but what we can see is that drought harmed producers and consumers, and there's less available for everyone, right? The smaller size of the triangle means that we went from a bigger triangle to a smaller triangle. So what happens if the price is above equilibrium? When the price is too high, that means that the quantity demanded is less than the quantity supplied. And what does that mean? If you show up at a store and there's lots of supply and not many people buying, that's what we call a surplus. Now, when the price is too low, it's lower than equilibrium, you show up at the store, there is plenty of demand, but there's not enough supply and there's shortages and people waiting in line, right? And so we can think of this if we have any type of intervention that's going to cause the price to be above or below equilibrium. So say that the government puts in place a price floor where the price can't go lower than PS in graph A, then we end up with a situation where there's a surplus of goods, right? The price is too high. If we end up with the government saying, look, the price can't go higher, we set in place. So surplus, one way of thinking about it is going to be if we have a minimum wage, right? So the wages are higher than equilibrium, then there's going to be lots of people wanting to work and not as much demand for that labor, right? And so we end up with excess workers available, which we call unemployment at a macro level. If the government introduced a price control where the price couldn't go above, like a rent control, then you'd say, look, there's going to be a shortage. There's lots of people wanting the cheaper price and not as many companies willing to sell it. So markets over time will converge to equilibrium. And so what happens is it's not an instantaneous shift. It's a balancing back and forth, where as the curve shifts, prices hone in closer and closer to equilibrium. So we can imagine the producer's decision is based on the year 1 price. And so they go a little high, and consumers are based on year 2 pricing. And so consumers are wanting The consumers are looking at that price and then determining the quantities they want. And so if that happens where we end up at price P1 and we bounce around back and forth and oscillate. So initially the price is too high, there's a surplus, so producers lower the price. If they lower it too low, right, they're not targeting an actual price, they're just trying to find the perfect place to be. Then what happens is when it's low prices, they run out of stock. And so if we're talking about agricultural goods that take time to grow, the first year, the producers might have too high a price and they end up with excess. And so they're discounting heavily towards the end, and when their product is going to perish at the end of its life expectancy, or before they have to dump it to the cannery for even less money. And so the next year they say, okay, we came in too high, we're going to come in a little better, right? For the next cycle. They come in a little too low, and this time they run out of stock, right? And they say, man, we could have sold more. And over time, they're going to keep bouncing back and forth between higher and lower prices, all while everything else is happening in the economy, right? And so this cobweb theory really assumes that there's stability in the production environment that doesn't exist in agricultural, but it is an interesting theory nonetheless, right? It's the way things would oscillate. If we were thinking about a non-agriculture good or something that grew really quick, like a hydroponic lettuce farm, right, where you can adjust very quickly to changes in market supply, cost structure from producer side or to demand for your product, right? You can ramp up and down production fairly easy or shift between different types of lettuce crops in that hydroponic arrangement. Then you might see something like this happen over the short run, right? Because that's a very controlled growing environment, kind of like it's more like a factory farm, right? It's like a t-shirt factory. You can control how many t-shirts and the colors. I have a friend who runs old friend who runs a hydroponic farm that specializes in lettuces, and she's very quick to be able to adjust her output levels. So anyway, but this adjustment is not instantaneous, right? It takes time. And really what's happening is producers and consumers are searching out for that perfect price, and eventually they find it. I like to think about it when you're coming into season on a new crop. And, maybe a good way to think about this is start going to the farmer's market if you don't already, because it's a very good little microcosm of a mini economy, right? And so when you go farmer's market, when the season's first starting for a crop, even when the produce isn't looking that great. So I think like strawberries are coming in, and the strawberries aren't looking that great. They're not tasting all that great yet, but the prices tend to be too high, right? Because there's not a lot of product. A lot of the farms, some of the farms might have beat other farms to production, or some farmers are willing to get that product out there quicker to be first. And so hence why it's not tasting as good or looking as good, because it's being harvested a little too early. And so those prices still tend to be high because there's not a lot of supply. As other producers see those higher prices, they're trying to do anything they can, not that you have a lot of control, to get those strawberries to get ready and start yielding quicker. And so through the season, you see those high prices start to drop as the producers find the balance between here's how much is going to exist, right? Because prior to harvest, you don't know how much you're really going to have. You just have estimates. One of the things I know as someone who trades commodities futures on a all too frequent basis is that the estimates that the USDA has for corn, soy, and cotton output is usually drastically off of what is actually produced, right? And sometimes the estimates get close, but they're never exactly where you're going to be. They're either high or low. And so there's different surveys that different groups do of different agricultural commodities around the world, and they give out their estimates. And those estimates are always just at their estimates. It's not till farmers actually start selling the good that you see what's needed. There's also short-term geographic disturbances. So maybe the national price for corn is, 6 cents a bushel or whatnot, 6 a bushel. But what you find is you might have a particular grain mill that is paying more or less based on local market conditions and the capacity that they have. Maybe they've got more capacity, so they're going to pay a little bit more to try to induce farmers to come to them so that they can reach full efficient capacity. Maybe they're over capacity, so they start dropping price. and say, look, you want a better price, you have to ship your corn outside our market, right? And farmers and producers play that game. My friend who does wheat farming a while back realized he didn't like the prices, and he's a very well off large farmer. And so he ended up storing his own wheat, his own grain, until prices climbed. And it ended up, they did climb before the wheat went bad, and wheat's fairly stable over time. And so he was able to get a far better price by waiting out the conditions. But remember, there's storage costs, there's the cost of financing on what you've borrowed to produce that crop in the first place. And so there's all these costs that go into figuring out whether it's worthwhile to hold or not hold, right? And so try to be dispassionate, but you can only do what you can do. So just the summary of what we've gone over is finding the market equilibrium and calculating producer and consumer surpluses, what happens when those curves shift, and how that impacts the consumer producer surplus. And then the fact that if prices are above or below the equilibrium price, then we end up with market surpluses or market shortages. So I'd like to thank all of you for watching this today. And as always, feel free to reach out, give me a call, text if you have any questions. Thank you very much.